J. Franklin Booth was born in 1874, the third of 8 children to a Quaker couple, on a farm just outside Carmel, Indiana. From the outset he was obsessed with drawing, and in addition to making sketches and studies of the wildlife, farming stock and scenery around his home, he taught himself to work in pen and ink by copying the illustrations he saw in books and magazines. What he didn't realise at the time was that these pictures are all being engraved in either wood or metal for reproduction, and he dutifully emulated the thousands of descriptive lines used in a typical engraving in his own pen and ink drawings. He later took a correspondence course in art while still living in Indiana, and he subsequently studied, but only for a few months in each case, at both the Art Institute of Chicago and the Art Students League in New York. And at some point during his studies, if not before, he must have realised his mistake. Nevertheless, when he created his first professional illustrations as a staff artist with the Indianapolis News in 1899, he was committed to this distinctive print-friendly drawing technique, however unintentionally he had perfected it. And with a certain irony, by this time the great majority of images in books, magazines and newspapers were printed by the photolithographic process, which bypassed the need for engraving altogether. He continued to work for the newspaper up to 1904, in which year he created this remarkable magazine illustration titled The Marionettes, depicting tiny humans being controlled by huge personifications of both positive and negative human attributes. But not long after, he lost some of his professional momentum when he set off on an extended trip travelling around Europe. He returned to the USA in 1906 and continued to work freelance for a range of popular American magazines, including Good Housekeeping and Scribner's. He was in particular demand for the illustration of poetry, which was a popular and regular feature in the various magazines, and he demonstrated on many occasions just how evocative, emotionally engaging and visually absorbing his painstaking use of pen and ink could be. It was also in 1906 that he produced this far from typical comic strip for an unknown supplement, and it would be an isolated example of him deviating from his usual approach. More typically, a year later, he illustrated Of Such Is the Kingdom, a collection of stories written by Richard Metcalfe. These were fairly homespun and far from dramatic narratives, but Booth did his best to bring them to life with a series of fine, if uneventful, pen illustrations. In the same year, he stepped outside his usual graphic approach with a collection of painted illustrations for the Boys of the Old Glee Club, written by James Whitcomb Riley. And not only were the illustrations produced without any visible line work, but they were also printed in colours so muted you have to wonder why they bothered. But other than such very occasional departures, it remained his highly distinctive line technique with which he had the greatest popular success. And it was this and his fairly obvious affinity for creating compelling romantic scenes which continued to draw commissions from a range of popular American magazines of the day. And in addition to those he had acquired previously, he was by now also working regularly for other clients such as McClure's and Harper's Magazine. On occasion, Booth created similar images using scratchboard, again with striking results. But by far the majority of his illustrations continued to be produced with pen and ink, most frequently as monochromes, although there were occasional exceptions, such as this from 1908, which also incorporated limited colour applied in washes for no particular creative purpose. And he produced another of his infrequent painted landscapes for the full-colour cover of McClure's magazine in 1909. Booth was particularly prolific in this period, and the popularity of generally sentimental romantic poetry in the mainstream magazines alone kept him very busy as the illustrator of choice to invoke the inspirational and emotional qualities of the verses, which were artfully combined with his visualizations. Additionally, there was serialized fiction and short story work on offer, as well as articles on travel or even more mundane subject matter such as favourite golf courses, which he could bring similar swirling romantic visual qualities to. And at this point he was undoubtedly among the most popular and respected illustrators in the country, with an income which reflected his lofty status. Then in 1913, The Flying Islands of the Night, a 3-act fantasy play written by his friend James Whitcomb Riley, was published, featuring a collection of astonishing colour images by Booth. All these full-page illustrations appeared set within this decorative border, but I've taken the liberty of removing it to allow the images to be as big on screen as possible. The book had been published previously without illustrations and had fared poorly in terms of sales. But with this body of work, Booth seized the opportunity to demonstrate his ability to combine his trademark linear approach with an equally distinctive application of colour washes. The results were a considerable aesthetic and narrative triumph, and like so much of his magazine work, his penchant for awe-inspiring arrangements with the characters confined to the lower parts of the image, set within towering environments of all kinds, was well to the fore. Arguably, this book constituted Booth's greatest achievement, and is rightly now considered a classic symbiosis of writer and illustrator. A year later he returned to magazine work and among other commissions created a collection of monochrome illustrations to accompany a series of Native American verses transcribed by Mary Austin. And it was also in 1914 that he illustrated the book The Poet by Meredith Nicholson, for which he returned to the same combination of line and textured wash technique used in the previous year's Flying Islands of the Night, but with conspicuously less dramatic power and visual fascination due to the more everyday real-world narrative content of the book. More black and white magazine illustration employing his hatching and stippling techniques with varying levels of complexity followed, including some with an agreeably Japanese theme. And in 1915 he created more to illustrate an article on the subject of tiger hunting in India. Among them was this truly astonishing dynamic composition, and closer inspection of this image reveals the wide range of jaw-dropping expressive pen techniques Booth could bring to so many of his works with apparent and enviable authority. In 1916 Booth produced another fully painted cover for Collier's magazine, and in the same year he illustrated 2 more books. Once Upon a Time in Indiana was a fairly mundane low-key history of the state by the writer Charity Dye, which prompted some equally pedestrian monochromes from Booth. By this time he was living and working in New York, but he continued to return to Indiana during the summer months, and this led to the other book of 1916, a collaboration with the writer Theodore Dreiser. A Hoosier Holiday was a record of a 2-week automobile trip that the pair took from New York to Indiana. Unusually for Booth, the 30 or so illustrations he produced were loosely rendered in charcoal and barely recognisable as his work. Nevertheless, they served as an energetically rendered record of their journey. In 1917 he illustrated another 2 books while still managing to maintain his relationships with his magazine clients. From Death to Life by Russian novelist Alexei Apukhin was a particularly obscure candidate for illustration, but it nevertheless provided Booth with the opportunity to create some highly evocative, if gloomy, pen and ink drawings. But more significantly, 1917 also saw the publication of a colour edition of Mark Twain's story The Prince and the Pauper. For this book, Booth returned to the blend of line and wash he had so successfully utilised for the Flying Islands book, and although the narrative couldn't afford him the same spectacular subject matter, Booth nevertheless produced a large number of accomplished and absorbing illustrations of the story, and the book was a popular success at the time. He was particularly adept at creating believably medieval environments and must have taken considerable care in getting the period details of architecture and costume accurately evoked. By this time the USA had joined the Allies in the First World War, and Booth started to create a range of images reflecting on his country's part in the conflict, including this colour poster encouraging the buying of Liberty bonds to aid the war effort. And there were other images referencing the conflict published in his usual stable of magazines, some of which were to accompany verses on the subject. In none of his wartime work did he ever create negative propaganda aimed at the enemy, and confined himself to patriotic and emotionally rousing images. With the war over just a year later, he returned to his usual preferred fantasy subject matter. Romantic evocations of ships at sea featured strongly, including this colour cover for Life magazine in 1921. To date, Booth had had virtually no involvement with advertising work, but in 1922 he began a significant press ad campaign for the Este home organ, apparently a must-have purchase for the better off in the USA at the time. And Booth being Booth, he used this opportunity to create some highly fanciful, swirling melodramatic images with which to draw in the prospective buyer. Given the volume of advertisements he created, it seems to have been a major success for the company, and it's hard if not impossible to think of another ad campaign of the period which aspired to similar grandiosity. In 1923, at the age of 49, he married one of his models, the 21-year-old Beatrice Whitmack, who was the young sister of pulp artist Edward Franklin Whitmack, who had first introduced them. In 1925, he was one of the co-founders of the Phoenix Art Institute, and he taught hopeful young students there for the next 2 decades. This was also the year that the first collection of his works to date was published, in a book with text by Robert Frank, titled simply Franklin Booth, which boasted 60 reproductions of his original artwork taken from various of his earlier commissions. The earlier extensive Este Organs press campaign had been in addition to his ongoing magazine work and would have made a significant contribution to his already considerable income, and he returned to more lucrative advertising work in the following years, with press ads for others including a health food manufacturer and a 2-colour press ad for Studebaker cars in 1927. As the 1920s drew to a close, Booth surpassed himself with this spectacular colour magazine illustration to accompany a verse by Milton, and in 1929 he branched out into design with his Art Deco styled table lamp. In 1931, Booth created illustrations for a booklet titled The Telephone's Message, printed in 2 colours. Despite the grandiose overblown language used, it was merely a marketing device for the phone company themselves. But such was Booth's prowess that he could bring his romantic imagination and unerring compositional strengths to the least inspiring of subjects, and command the reader's attention and admiration with the suggested drama of his images. And 2 years later he brought the same qualities to bear when he created this ad celebrating the benefits of airmail delivery on behalf of the Postal Service. Throughout the 1930s, Booth continued to work for magazines despite the emerging changes in visual fashions, even though it was at a reduced rate compared to his earlier output. And among others was this impressive colour piece for the cover of the Elks magazine in 1934. In the middle of the decade, he was also regularly writing articles for the Professional Art Quarterly. And so it continued for the rest of the decade, and in 1940 he created this for the Atlantic Phone Company to commemorate 25 years of transcontinental telephone lines. In 1943 he created a quartet of magazine illustrations based on the 4 freedoms as outlined in Franklin D. Roosevelt's speech to the American nation in 1941, but by his own usually dramatic standards they were somewhat lacklustre and overwhelmed by the greater popular success enjoyed by Norman Rockwell's painted interpretations published in the same year. He was already in his 70s by this time and only created a few more illustrations, including some monochromes and colour work to illustrate the birth of Christ, when in 1946 he suffered a stroke which left him quite seriously incapacitated. A year later the book 20 Franklin Booth Masterpieces was published, which made a fitting final tribute to the man and his work, and he died in 1948 at the age of 74 in New York. The list of others, both past and present, who are on record as being great admirers of Booth's technique is pretty much a who's who of pen and ink illustration, and it's easy to see why. The descriptive power of his technique and attention to detail could not really be bettered or even matched by any other I can think of. What had begun as a technical misunderstanding ended up making him one of the most distinctive illustrators of the early 20th century. and his ability to manipulate the viewer's emotions with his depictions of monumental romantic fantasy has subsequently fed into the work of many others working in that arena.